This is not a shir in Parsha, the portion of the week, but the theme that I want to talk about is expressed in the first verse of this week's Parsha. At this point in the narrative, the Jewish people have already left Egypt, and the subject is the route that they traveled. Why? Because Baruch Hu took them on a particular route. The words that introduce that subject are Vayihi b'shalach Paro es ha'am. It happened when Pharaoh released the people. Now that's old news. I mean, that's written at great length in the previous Parsha. If you're just trying to tell me this is the route that it took, it should say Vayisa the people traveled, or when they left. Why putting in the fact that Pharaoh released them? What's that got to do with the subject matter? And I think we have to, in order to understand that, we have to at least describe in detail exactly what the circumstances were when they were released. Now, this is expressed in detail in a verse that we say in the Haggadah. We're explaining why we eat matzah. And this is Parak Yud Beis, the 12th chapter of Exodus. Pasuk Lamed Tes, verse 39. Now listen to this verse, and we'll have to analyze it in some detail. They left Egypt, after that, a great multitude of people, a great livestock, and it says, they baked the dough that they took out of Egypt into cakes of matzos, for it did not become leavened. For they were driven from Egypt, for they could not delay, and also they had not made provisions for themselves. Wow, there's a lot going on in this pasuk. They left Egypt, they traveled the whole daytime, now came nighttime, and they came to the first stopover. What did they eat for supper? So it says, well, said previously they took dough, fresh dough, that they made in Egypt, and they bundled it up in cloth and put it over their shoulders, tramping through the desert, they're carrying this dough. So here, the night of the 16th of Nisan, 24 hours after the night of the Seder, they baked the dough that they took out of Egypt. Now, what did they bake it into? Cakes of matzos. This is the night of the 16th. The Seder was last night. This is the night after the Seder. And the Torah telling you they made matzos. So you may think, well, isn't the festival of Passover 7 days? So what else? What alternative do they have? What choice? Of course it's matzos. No, the Torah tells you that's not the reason. Now, first of all, you might think, they're carrying it on their shoulders for 12 hours. Maybe it leavened while it was on their shoulders. No, that didn't happen. And our sources take from this a general rule: as long as you are working the matzah, as long as it's not still, quiescent, it doesn't leaven. It requires stillness to leaven. So they were walking the whole time and bouncing on their shoulders, and it didn't become leavened. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been matzah. Okay, that's one thing. Now, why didn't it become leavened before? They made the dough in Egypt. Why didn't it leaven in Egypt? I'll tell you why. For they were driven from Egypt. They were pushed out, forced out. You say they were pushed out and forced out? That means if they hadn't been pushed and forced, then what? Then they would have taken their time. They weren't in any rush. They had things to do. Oh, those Egyptians are coming with their bayonets and pushing us out. But if not, listen, we had things to do. And we just had to give up on them. And what are these things they had to do? Well, they were driven out, they could not delay, and they didn't make any provisions for themselves. After all, it's a long trek. Why do you have to bake the dough which you took out of Egypt on the night of the 16th? Tired, hungry. Wouldn't it have been more efficient, more reasonable to bake some provisions for the way on the night of the 15th in Egypt? Then you could, instead of carrying raw dough and having to bake it at the first stopover, you could have carried the provisions and just eaten them. Oh, see, but they couldn't. They couldn't because the Egyptians pushed them out, and they couldn't delay. But if they hadn't been able to delay, that's what they would have done. They would have made angels' challahs or Burman's challahs and wrapped them in saran wrap and then taken them with them on the desert, and then at night after they would have eaten them. Says the Ran, you have to understand the legal context. Their Pesach was not like our Pesach. It didn't have the same rules. First of all, the prohibition against eating chametz was 1 day, 24 hours, period. Number two, there was no prohibition of possessing chametz. We not only are not allowed to eat it, we can't even possess it. No, there was no prohibition at all of possessing chametz. So their thought was, okay, it's the night of the 15th. Tomorrow we're leaving. We're going to trek through the desert. What are we going to eat tomorrow night? Well, we have this dough. We'll let the dough rise. We'll bake it here. We'll put it in plastic bags. And then tomorrow night, since it's not prohibited to own chametz, we'll own it. We won't eat it. And tomorrow night, when we get to the stopover place, then we'll eat it. But they couldn't do that. Couldn't do that because they were pushed out too fast. They had no chance to tarry, which they would have, and make provisions for themselves. Okay, so then that means that they didn't, the way and the time that they left was not willingly. They didn't jump at the chance to go. On the contrary, they had thoughts about preparing for the trip, which means it could take some time, but we're not in a hurry. Right? So it comes out that the exodus from Egypt was not wholly their initiative. It was not wholly their will. It was not wholly their resolution. Part of it was due to Pharaoh pushing them out. Now, we are very committed to the idea that historical events aren't random, and they have meaning and significance, especially when the Torah makes a point of describing them. After all, information about real matters in the world is potentially infinite. Even one observation is potentially infinite, because if you measure its size in real numbers are infinitely complex. So you have to make a selection. And every culture, and even within a culture, every type of literature selects the information in a different way. Our selection of information is information which enables us to lead better spiritual lives, to relate to God in a better way. It's all got to be useful. If the Torah describes it, it means it serves some purpose in that regard. What is it about Pharaoh's pushing us out that should teach us something about how to serve God? Now, having said that, let's go on at the beginning of this week's parsha. What is it that follows from the fact that Pharaoh pushed us out? It says, God did not take them by the way of the land of the Philistines, even though it was near. The key here means even though, not because. Now, there's a direct route from where they were, having crossed the Red Sea, into the land of Israel. God didn't take them that way. Why not? The Torah says explicitly. God said perhaps the people will reconsider when they see a war, and they will return to Egypt. It happened when Pharaoh pushed them out that God said, maybe they'll see a war and return to Egypt. That's not A and Q. you have two statements back to back that have something to do with one another. Pharaoh's pushing them out, and then when they see war, they're gonna, why? What's the connection between the two? Superficially, we'll do it in more depth a little bit later, but superficially, as I said, it wasn't their initiative. It wasn't their statement and commitment that they're the ones who are going out, that they're the ones who are free. They had things to do in Egypt. They weren't in such a hurry to leave. The detachment from Egypt was forced on them. Therefore, it wasn't genuinely theirs. It wasn't a genuine expression of their identity. Nope. They have this attitude, so then they don't have full. Now, independence is a relative term in this context. Independence from earthly power, independence from the respect of other earthly cultures, independence from the condition of slavery that they were living in. When they see an armed force coming against them, they'll panic. They won't be able to stand up to them because they didn't go out on their own, because they didn't take the opportunity and run. So that's why God didn't take them straight into the land of Egypt, into the land of Israel. He took them by a roundabout way. Now, this has further consequences. My Rebbe Zatzal, the Boston Rebbe, pointed out that there is a string of compromised incidents which stem from this initial failure. When the Torah is given to the Jewish people, Torah indicates, the oral tradition explains, that God held the mountain over their heads and said, if you're willing to accept it, fine. If not, this is where you're going to die. They needed a little prodding to accept the Torah totally. Why did they need the prodding? Why wasn't it just a joyful, total, unconditional acceptance? Because that required being detached from the Egyptians, you see. And the offer to be detached was made when Pharaoh released them. And if they had joyfully accepted it and gone out enthusiastically, then the detachment would have been complete, but it wasn't complete. The detachment wasn't complete. Since the detachment wasn't complete, they didn't stand to making the transition to becoming servants of Hashem wholeheartedly. They had to have a prodding, they had to have a threat applied to them. So the receiving of the Torah wasn't complete. Well, but then after the receiving of the Torah, you have the golden calf. The golden calf didn't have to happen. They faced a certain stress. There was a certain test. It seems like Moses is gone. You don't know where Moses is. Can you remain faithful to the principle that you've received? Remain trusting that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will manage the situation for you? No, they failed that. Then, when the spies came back with the terrible report about the state of the land of Israel, and it wasn't a unanimous report, because Yeshua and Gottleib said it was wonderful, and we can conquer it. That was another test. Which way are you going to go? Whose report are you going to accept? God did promise you you're going there. Gottleib and Yeshua are clearly right, but because they didn't detach themselves from Egypt, and therefore they didn't accept the Torah, and therefore they had the golden calf, so therefore they failed that test as well. So these historical events have consequences. Now, the message here is not fatalism. You failed once, you're sunk. There isn't a religion that's like that. Don't laugh too quickly. There's a whole religion with a couple of billion people signed up who feel that there was one failure and you're sunk. Right? And you have to have some external way of escaping that condemnation. But the Torah's lesson is not that. The lesson is that at every juncture, at each stage, you have the opportunity to correct it. At each stage, you have the opportunity to correct it. It can be corrected. So, when they stood at Sinai, they had the opportunity to correct it. And that's another story, which I'll tell you on another occasion. At any rate, that's the one thing that we learned, that failures have consequences, and means it becomes more difficult to correct and requires more attention and more effort. When I was young, I played a musical instrument, I played the flute, and I performed many times. And the rule was that you're learning a new piece of music, playing it for the first time, don't make a mistake. Play it slowly, much too slowly, don't make a mistake. Because every time you make a mistake, it takes 10 times playing it over right to undo the mistake from your fingers. That's right. You can't just do it right the next time. Because the first time you did it that way, that has an undue influence on the way so you want to build the foundation, make sure the foundation is right. Do it right the first time. So, let's look again at the nature of the mistake in the first case and see what exactly was the context. They're being told to go out into a wilderness, a place where naturally there's no food. Okay, they have animals. They took a lot of animals with them. The prophets sing the praise of the Jewish people. You followed me into the wilderness, a place where you don't sow, don't reap, no food produced naturally on the ground that could sustain you, and you followed me. Did they follow Hashem really blind? Did they simply say, we're coming, forgetting about the circumstances, the consequences? Not according to this. But say the lo also lehem. They didn't make provisions for the way, which they would have made if they just had a little more time. But they didn't have the time because they were pushed out. That was a failure. Now, this is a failure of not trusting in the simplest but second most necessary type of physical support. The most necessary is oxygen. You have to breathe. And after that comes food and drink to sustain yourself. And here's a case where food and drink shouldn't have been on the menu. They shouldn't have been on the spiritual guide for the situation. They simply should have said, he'll take care of us. As indeed in the end he did. There was the manna that they ate in the well of Miriam that gave them water. They had experienced great miracles. They were in the middle of a great miracle. The Egyptian firstborn were dropping dead all around them. There's no medical disease that attacks firstborn people. Ain't never said. Purely miraculous. So they should have risen to that circumstance and said, victuals for supper? Forget it. We can certainly trust God for that. And they didn't, and that was a failure. An expression of this, which is right there in Rashi, but in the Targum, people don't, when they first say they want to leave Egypt to sacrifice in the desert, the Pharaoh says, what's your problem? Offer your sacrifices here. We have to go to the desert for it. And they say, and the Egyptians, for whom these animals that we are going to sacrifice are religious animals, they're animals that are sacred to their religion, they'll see us sacrificing those animals, they won't stone us. We're going into the wilderness. So the commentators ask, are you afraid of being stoned? Hello? Didn't they get beaten up by plague after plague? Aren't they on the run? Why are they letting you go? They're letting you go because they're afraid of you. Are you really afraid of being stoned? If you look in the Oculus there, it says, no. What we're afraid is that when we offer these animals in your face to the Egyptians, they're going to say to themselves, going to grumble. If we had stones, we would throw stones. That we hate them. We hate what they're doing. We're provoking them. We don't want to provoke them. We certainly won't be in danger, but we don't want to provoke them. Kind of sensitivity on the part of the Jews not to poke it in the face of the Egyptians. But they were invulnerable. They're clearly invulnerable. So that being the case, to have worried about where to make your food for tomorrow night's supper was a mistake. They should have themselves run at the first chance that they had when Pharaoh. And therefore, since they didn't, Pharaoh had a hand in their exodus. And since he had a hand in their exodus, it wasn't independent. but it wasn't independent. It wasn't complete. Indeed, some say that's why the splitting of the sea had to happen. What does the verse say at the beginning of this parsha? So he says, God said, if I take the way of the Philistines, they'll see war, and they'll go back to Egypt. And therefore, he turned the people via the desert, a path via the desert, Yam Suf, to Yam Suf, which is where the splitting of the sea took place. Now let's think. What happened at Yam Suf? Well, they encamped by the sea, and then Pharaoh heard about it, and Pharaoh decided he made a mistake, and he came chasing after them. And when they saw the legions of Pharaoh in the desert, the people said, well, our backs are to the water, to the right and left are mountain ranges, and coming down the valley is Pharaoh and his troops. We're done. It's over. We're dead. We're sunk. They'll take us back to slavery. There's no hope. And Moses said, everything's fine, guys. Fine. Toast the marshmallows on the campfire. Don't worry about anything. They said, don't worry. In 10 minutes, we're dead. What do you mean, don't worry? God will save you. Don't worry about it. So here it is again. Egyptians on one side. God will save you. Are you worried? Well, and then they get the order. Go into the water. Go into the water. Yes, go into the water. Yes. If they had all jumped into the water enthusiastically, then maybe that could have rectified the failure in the Exodus. It would have rectified the failure that they had to do it because of Pharaoh. That was the opportunity. But they didn't. So he jumped in. When he jumped in, went up to his neck, the water split, and then he went forth on dry land. But they didn't rectify it. But you see, they were given an opportunity to rectify it. So at each stage, in the case of the golden calf, I told you that what triggered the rebellion was the vision of Moses dead, the vision that God had them see, taking Moses' beard in the sky and thinking that he had died. And again, the attitude should have been, so what? The creator of the universe is leading us. So we won't have Moses. He'll provide something else. No. They wanted to make provisions. Here they couldn't jump into the water. There they wanted to make a substitute. They were not putting themselves totally into Hashem's hands. And the same thing is true with the spies. It's the same dynamic. The spies say that their land is beautiful, just like God promised, but we saw giants living there and forces we'll never be able to conquer. And what do Yeshua and Gottleib say? You're not fighting. God will fight for you. Just like he conquered the Egyptian empire, which at the time was one of the great world empires, so he'll conquer the city-states of Canaan as well. And they thought in terms of, we're going to fight a battle, and they're a trained army, and we're not a trained army, and we're sunk. So they weren't willing to hand over their circumstances to Kodesh Baruch Hu in full trust, and it was the same. So it's the same, a similar type of failure each time. Now, of course, the message here is not, so don't do anything, just fold your hands, twiddle your thumbs, and tomorrow morning when you wake up, there'll be a gold brick under your pillow. That's not our view, but it has to be balanced. It has to be balanced. You have to know when, what conditions, what circumstances, and what kinds of sacrifices to make in order to do the right amount of effort so as to be able to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the best possible way. We saw this in great drama in the beginning of the 20th century when millions of Jews came to America. And the problem was that if you didn't work on Saturday, if you'd said to your boss on Friday, I'm not coming in on Saturday, he said, okay, on Monday, get a new job. It was a 6-day week. If you didn't work 6 days, you didn't keep your job. Many, many Jews failed that test. Many Jews failed that test. People came, they came from Europe, some anyway, and tried to be faithful to the traditions. They had synagogues that practiced Judaism the way we would think of it. Orthodox Judaism, except for one thing. On Saturday morning, they had an early minyan. 7 o'clock minyan, 6:30 minyan. Because at 8:30, they went to work. So Moshe Feinstein, when he came to America, said, no early minyan on Shabbos. Don't let people think that they can compromise and get away with it. You can't work on Saturdays. And there was a family whose name I forget, but every Friday the father came home, and the Friday night meal, he told his children, we have been given a great opportunity to sanctify Shabbos, to show how precious Shabbos is to us. I was fired from my job today. Let's dance. Let's dance in joy that we were given the opportunity to show the holiness of Shabbos. So he got a new job every Monday morning. There were people who did that. And Rabbi Moshe, when he found out about it, said, this man's children will be great people. And they all were. They were all leading scholars. So this was again, it's in Gashmias. This is how will I make a living and how will I be able to support my family? You maybe have, if you learn the history of that period, you may have seen the picture of the Jewish pushcart driver, where he sold various things from a pushcart because he controlled his time. He wasn't working for anybody else. So he could work his 6 days, take Shabbos off. That's one of the reasons the Jews went into that. Door-to-door salesman, because that way they had the opportunity. So it's not a question of abandoning effort and just relying on miracles. We don't do that. But it's knowing when and where to make that choice. This is the and we live this out. We live this out. One has to realize that this Bishalach Pharaoh es ha'am, that Pharaoh was the one who was engineering the Exodus. We have to recognize that puts a weakness in us altogether. Nothing gets lost from history. You know, the Baal Shem Tov said that the Torah is eternal. What does it mean it's eternal? Yeah, it won't be changed. That's true. It won't be a new Torah like certain groups said that we violated the Torah, so God gave us new rules. New rules, no, that won't happen. But everything that's written in the Torah happens over and over again. Happens over and over again. And if we were adept at depth spiritual analysis, which would only be related in the thinnest possible way with what's called psychoanalysis, we'd be able to realize that in us there is a Pharaoh impulse and a Moses principle and an Aaron dedication and service and a Joseph self-control and the temptations. All of that panoply of history has echoes in the soul and the psyche of a Jew. And therefore, when you study what happened there, you will be able to apply it to certain things that happen in your life. There are times when a Jew is tempted, and tempted to do something which it looks like he can get away with, like Joseph. When nobody was in the house, it was all alone. Each one of those teaches us a little bit about the world in which we live and the principles that we have to try to use to operate successfully. Now, all of what I've said, the basic principle of the nature of history, is extremely important to everyone in this room, including me, and that is we come from a childhood different culturally, morally, spiritually from the style of life that we've adopted. The question is, how do we look at the new start? How do we look at it vis-a-vis the past? And this is something that you live with for the rest of your life. You don't escape this question, and your attitude towards it will determine a great deal of the way in which you live your Jewish life. About 40 years ago, the then editor of the Jerusalem Post came to Ohr Somayach to interview the leaders and some of the teachers and some of the students, because Ohr Somayach is a phenomenon. I was sitting there when he asked Rabbi Schiller, should be well, would you call yourself born-again Jews? It's a good question. Jews who come here often come from secular backgrounds, and then they change their lives quite considerably. Would you call yourself born-again Jews? And Rabbi Shiller said, absolutely not. Because born again implies that it's a fresh start. You cut your bonds with the past and you start to live a new life. We don't believe that that's possible, nor do we believe that is desirable. On the contrary, God didn't make a mistake when he put your soul into the family that he put it, at the time and place that he put it, that juncture of history. He didn't make a mistake. That's where you have to start from. So we look at this as growth into a new stage of development. Yes, could be that the new stage of development differs in its appearance from what was before, but it isn't a radical break with what was before. If you will take a look at the roots of a tree and take a look at the apple, I don't think you would naturally associate them. They don't look, feel, taste, and function naturally like each other. Very, very little in common. But without the roots, there's no apple. The apple is an expression of the roots. So here too, when you shift your priorities and shift your, I don't want to use the word style because it's a little flippant, the context of your activity and the details of the activity, but there are themes that pass through, and there are themes that transform, but they aren't replaced, simply cut off and replaced by other themes. They transform into the new situation. Person should from time to time ask, here's where I am, here's where I need to go. How do I make sense out of where I have been up until now in terms of that project? Often what you will find, unexpectedly, is that there are elements in the project which will aid you in the present and future. You didn't think of them that way at that time, but they in fact will enable you to do that. I knew one fellow who told me that he's quite bright. He told me that as a child growing up in Midwest, the fact that he was bright, the fact that he was interested in intellectual subjects, made him a social outcast, more or less. They were interested in sports and hunting and hiking and that sort of thing. Intellectual pursuits were for girls, not for boys. So, and he wasn't about to give it up. He loved it. So he said to me that he had to develop a kind of thick skin, develop a kind of immunity to certain types of criticism or being denigrated. And then he told me that when he decided to explore Judaism and to take on a traditional lifestyle, now he got the denigration from different quarters, some from his family and from his friends in college and so on and so on. But he already had thick skin. He knew how to use that. So he felt that protected him. So he could see a continuity. I went through this, but I wasn't religious. It had nothing to do with religion. But because I went through that, so then I saw here how to use that ability to help me in my religious development. That, I think, is the attitude that Rav Shiller was trying to stress. And by the way, when the article came out, the New York Times, it said, Rabbi Shiller said you should be a born-again Jew. The New York Times didn't start lying yesterday. They write what's good for their political message, and whether it has truth in it or not is of no interest to them, none whatsoever. Okay, so that's part of the challenge. And one element in the challenge, which I have heard from many people, which depresses them, is that, this is especially true for men, not so much as true for women, that you compare your scholarly ability with Jews who grew up in religious families, and you say, I'll never reach that. I'll never reach that. I remember myself, when I first went to a family for Friday night dinner, and then it came time to bench. Bench, but there are only chairs here. There are no benches here. And they take out these little tiny books with this. There was this Hebrew, and they say, okay, we're benching now, and the 6-year-old sits down. Finished! I can't find the page. I don't know where they're starting from. I thought, I'll never be like that. I'll never make that. You know? Yeah, that's true. You won't. But so what? You weren't meant to. You weren't meant to. If you had been meant to be like that, you'd have been put in a family like that. That's not your contribution. That's not what you need to do, where you'll find your spiritual expression. So for the commentators point this out, the difference between Abraham and Isaac. Abraham grew up in an idol-worshipping family. According to the Rambam, he was 48 when he discovered the Kodesh Baruch Hu. 48. Rambam says he offered sacrifices to idols with his own hands. Yitzchak was Kodesh Mibetin. He was holy before he was born. His life was a consistency of holiness. Abraham didn't have that. But Abraham, therefore, becomes the father of all future converts. Isaac can't do that, because Isaac didn't go through any such transition. Abraham went through a self-conversion from sheker to emes, from false picture of the world and fruitless activity to building the future. So because he did that, his life had this dual aspect. He becomes the father of people who live that dual aspect. He's their source of inspiration. He's their source of connection. Only he could do that. So that's the way in which you look at your past and think, okay, I started here, I'm making these transitions, I had to put tremendous effort into this and this type of part of the transition was very hard for me. How can I use that to help others? How can I use that to impress others or to guide others? I can tell you for myself that Jewish learning was very hard, still hard, but it was very hard because it did not use my natural talents. My natural talents lie in abstract thought and in calculation, consequences, logic. Knowledge, information, even before Google, I despised information. My attitude was, if you have to memorize it, it's not worth knowing. You have to memorize, it's not worth knowing. I learned math, I did a lot of math. My goal in math was, read the theorem and then figure out for yourself why it's true. Figure out your own proof. And when they asked for a proof, give your proof. Don't give the textbook's proof. Give your own proof. Because you have to understand it. To understand it, think about it on your own. Well, Jewish learning relies on information. You need a lot of information. You won't be trusted, you won't be a guide unless you have mastered a lot of information. When I realized that, I thought, man, I'm sunk. That's just not me. I don't remember things well. And then I'm very bad at languages. Oh, isn't that nice? So here the Gemara has in it 2 foreign languages with no punctuation. Ha, figure that out, Gottleib. This was not natural for me at all. And then third of all, being trained in mathematics and philosophy of mathematics, I had the wrong methodology. I'll never forget, I was sitting in this year, with Shlomo Sternberg of Harvard, who was a great professor of math at Harvard and frum guy, and learning the Dorim, and he mentioned a certain concept, Issa Chefza and Issa Gavra, 2 different concepts. I said to him, how do you define those things? And he said, we don't. It just kept going. I said, you don't? You don't define them? What do you mean you don't define them? How do you know what you're talking about? And he's a mathematician. That's my field. Everything's defined. Everything is defined. I couldn't figure it out. I could not figure it out. It took me 5 years to realize that Gemara learning is much more like theoretical empirical science than it is like math. The key concepts in theoretical and empirical science are arrived at the end, not at the beginning. What is force? What is energy? What is matter? You don't start with that. You start with observations. You start with regularities. Start by trying to describe them and relate them to one another. Then you build a picture. As you build a picture, you see you're using certain concepts over and over again. So you try to make them basic. As you go, you refine them. When you make new observations, you refine what they mean. Like Chezkas Abatim, for those of you who know what that is, 30 daf. We have case after case after case after case, and each case forces you to redefine all the concepts you had before. It's a process of constant redefinition. I wasn't used to that. It took me 5 years to figure out that was going on. So it was a big, big challenge for me. It's still a challenge in many ways, but getting into it and learning the lingo and learning the style of reasoning was a big, big challenge. Okay, but having worked through the challenge, not that I totally succeeded in that, but I worked through the challenge, I know now how to encourage other people. I know what the challenge means for them. And I know how to give pointers to them to be able to sustain themselves psychologically when they're facing the challenge. And it carries over to other challenges where you may have personal challenges of midos, where your midah is very naturally one type of midah, and you have to learn to tame it and to work towards another midah. I had another fellow who, I don't know how, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know exactly. He always felt the need to be superior to everybody else. And that caused him not only to make great efforts to be tops, but he would criticize other people and tear them down, and he wouldn't praise anybody else. Some said it was an inferiority complex. I don't know whether that is really true or isn't true, but let's say. And it expressed itself in tremendous competitiveness. And he had to compete to the top. Cooperative effort to him was something totally foreign. Cooperative? You get ahead. Life is a zero-sum game at every turn. There's a winner and a loser. Be a winner. Don't be a loser. And it took him years of struggle to get to the point where he could do something to make somebody else successful. That wasn't his vocabulary. That was a big struggle. So that was a big struggle for him. Other people have other big struggles. If you go through a big struggle where you're living in a situation that's not natural for you, if you had chosen an activity to express your strengths, you wouldn't have chosen this. I certainly wouldn't have chosen this. But then you've faced that kind of disorienting struggle, and it enables you to face other struggles like that, and also to work with people who need help with that sort of way. To look at the transition from your past to your future as a creative, organic transformation. Again, the root gives rise to the trunk gives rise to the branches give rise to leaves, and after leaves, petals, which aren't like leaves. And then after the petals comes the fruit. There are very significant differences there, but it's all one organic development. Similarly, you should try to look at your past and your present and your future as a sequence of organic developments, so that it is a whole. There's a wholeness to your life, not I was going down the wrong path up to here, and my life started over again over here, and the rest of that is just off the track. From our point of view, theologically, that would mean that Kodesh Baruch Hu made a mistake with the first part of your life. We're not going to accept that. We're not going to accept that. That's where you had to be. Okay, questions up to here? Yeah.
So, if we interpret the seed of the following mistakes that the Jewish people made in the moment when they weren't ready to just go after they were released from slavery. So, should we? I think should we interpret that as those mistakes also as part of the organic consequence of having that first? They weren't willing to.
Okay, so it's an interesting question. Yeah, the mistakes there were organic development, but not all organic developments are equal. There is a disease called cancer. That's also organic, but it kills you. See, the cells are multiplying. Isn't that good? That's how you grow. That's how you replace dead cells, by cells multiplying, but not out of control, not without direction, not without differentiation. So you say the growth here has to be organic, but not every organic growth is equal in correctness, in validity, and in value. You have to seek the one that's appropriate, and then you have to make an effort to be this organic growth rather than that organic growth. But the general lesson that's being taught is this is a theme of life. Your challenge, this way what you said is very good. Your challenge to make an organic growth. Don't try to start over, it won't work. This is hard for Americans. I don't know, when I was growing up, there was this myth of the present. There is no past, the past doesn't matter. American Revolution was, in certain ways, quite a radical break with the past of its time. And individual Americans, certain parts of American ethos, inherited that idea that the past doesn't matter, and you can make your own way, and you're, on the top of the chain, and you don't have to, and it's very, very superficial. It's very superficial. Because whether you know it or not, you're growing out of something. There are certain things that you take for granted that are part of the culture that you grow out of, and because it's so widely taken for granted, either you don't notice it at all, or if you notice it, you think it's something which is genetic, when it isn't. It's cultural. It's just, and then that's your organic progression, and that shows whether you want that organic progression or a different organic progression. But to deny the rootedness in the past is just terribly, terribly blind. You are rooted in the past. So yeah.
So my question is, how you was thinking about the all the tests that Am Israel had when they exited Egypt, whether to enter the ocean, the sea, and they failed it. So my question is, how obvious were the miracles? And when you said it, I will think about that. Even in the first Gulf War, they said that all the missiles from Iraq didn't kill anyone. Only one died from a heart attack or something. So it's also a miracle. So I'm thinking in their case, how obvious was, because it is reasonable to not jump in the ocean or to fear out of war where you're not armed. It's reasonable thoughts.
Okay, yeah, it's very good. I think you're right. This is the kind of reasoning that I'm talking about. Compare our situation with their situation and see what it was like. Now let's just look at the one that you're talking about. I think this is quite interesting. People ask you a question in somewhat different terms, but it's the same logic, Why didn't it settle all questions and settle all disputes? These miracles that took place, the plagues, the pillar of fire, the pillar of cloud, and the manna and all the rest. Why didn't it just settle all possible doubts? And the answer is because we're not taking into account the context. So, 1 second. We're not taking into account the context. Let's just rehearse the context a little bit. So you have 10 plagues. According to the tradition, each plague lasted a week. For the blood, that's an interesting question, what it means. And then in between there were 3 weeks. Until the next plague. None of the plagues repeated. Now, remember, the whole of the world at that time believed in miracles. My God did a miracle yesterday. Yeah, what else is new? So did mine. My God is the sun. He's shining all the time, isn't he? Yours is just from 12 to 1. He took time off. My God is on 24/365. 24/7/365. The Nile, every year, for the time of human history, overflows and gives it fertility every year. That's real. That's a real production, So the fact that your God did a miracle, so what? It's just one of the club. And, for example, the Nile turns to blood. So that's like a battle, and the Nile's bleeding. Only once. He doesn't attack the Nile another time, does he? I'll tell you why. Because the first time, he snuck up behind him when he wasn't looking, and he attacked him. But now the Nile's looking. Now he's careful. He doesn't dare attack him now, does he? Watch, see? You'll see, he won't touch the Nile again, predicts the Egyptian. And he's right. Doesn't attack the Nile again. So the fact that the miracles were taking place, why didn't the Egyptians become monotheists and become Jews? Because all the gods do miracles. And all the gods have their ups and downs. On a cloudy day, it's because the wind blows clouds in front of the sun to hide the sun. The sun, sure, clouds, no sunlight, cold, windy. But then the sun evaporates the clouds, and then there's no clouds. So this one is up, and this one is up. They do that all the time. So the fact that these miracles were taking place didn't have the effect because they lived at a time when miracles were common fare. And that's one of the differences with our times. If there would be a column of fire march down Fifth Avenue, from Washington Heights down to the Bowery, right, it would be all over. It would be all over. The secular culture would collapse. The whole ideology would collapse because, from their point of view, that can't happen. That can't happen. There's only nature, and it will be over. For them, it wasn't like that. So you have to put that into context. Now here, and that's why jumping. Oh, by the way, don't forget that in the 3 days of darkness, 80% of the Jews died. So whoever this is, or whatever it is that's bringing about the plagues, could be dangerous for us also. It isn't just a matter of slapping the Egyptians and promoting us. No. It can be critical of us as well. I wanted to say it, I didn't say it before. When they say let's go back to Egypt, it's happened several times. And I think most people read it wrongly. So you see that in the slave mentality. You see that they would rather be slaves than be free. No. They just won a war. They brought the Egyptian powers to their knees. They're going back to be masters, not slaves. They're going to take over. Like Pharaoh said to his people. They'll join our enemies, and then v'olam min haaretz, he'll leave the land. And the commentators say, no, they're not talking about leave that they want. Why would they want to leave the land? They'll take over. V'olim min haaretz b'boilei. What the pasuk should have said is, Pharaoh should have said, we'll leave the land. They'll kick us out and take over. That was the natural expectation. And that's what they said. The Egyptians are on their knees. When we come back, we'll be lords of the land. What do we have to go through the desert for? And then face up against the enemy, the armies of the kings of the city-states in Canaan. Why should we do that? So I think that's right. I think that the rationalization side, we've talked about that before when you weren't here, the ability to rationalize, when you put it into the context, you see that it wasn't just black and white. And that means we have to look forward to also non-black and white challenges where there is another way to look at it. And I haven't said this yet tonight, but this is really a very important principle of Jewish reasoning and Jewish Musar. Rav Desta writes about this, that the rationalizations gain their plausibility from bad character traits. Mesilas Yesharim writes about this. And they don't gain it from strict logic, they gain it from bad character traits. Mesilas Yesharim describes someone who, in winter's morning, it's cold outside. He's got to go to shul, and he's cold, and he's tired, and he says, I'm sure it's dangerous outside. I'm sure I'll catch a cold if I go outside. Yeah, but if it were evening and you were going to a party and it was cold, you wouldn't be sure you would catch a cold. It's your laziness talking. Your desire for rest and sleep. So it makes it plausible. So is worrying about your health a reasonable worry? Sure it is. Of course, that's not unreasonable. That's not irresponsible, except when there isn't really a danger to your health. And then, so you have to ask yourself, when I'm considering these alternatives, considering these challenges, in addition to questioning the factual basis for them, I also have to question the emotional root in me from which it comes, because that could lead me to misjudge them. The Chanan Wasserman asks, how can you criticize an atheist if he doesn't keep the commandments? If there's no commander, then there's no commandments. And there's nothing that's binding on you. He's an atheist. So Chanan says, and this is the only way to do it, but he says, I would ask him the following. You know of people who are religious? Do you know of intelligent, educated people who are religious? Sure he does. Of course he does. Well, if you had a question what to do about your health, or about your business, or about your security, and there were different views, and they were held by intelligent, educated people, wouldn't you make an investigation? Of course I would. It's my health, my money, it's my security. But you didn't make an investigation about religion? No. Why not? Why wasn't this as important to you as your health or your security? Because I go snorkeling on Saturdays. I'm so sorry, I just can't give that up. Well, that's not reasonable. That's not rational and responsible. That's just prejudice. And then he can be held responsible. Be held responsible for not having investigated this issue in the same way that he would have investigated other issues had he been unbiased. You're criticizing for his bias. So when you see in our historical sources cases where people were biased because of these types of things, you think to yourself, okay, I'm not just going to sit here and laugh at them because they made a mistake. I have to think, when do I do that sort of thing? That's one of the things that Baal Shem Tov meant when he said the Torah is eternal. The themes in the Torah and the style of events in the Torah is something which repeats over and over again. And we can learn how to understand our world and our lives by applying those principles. Okay? Okay.